I am DM Zone, this is Gamer's Oasis. Let's get into it. So in this video I'm going to talk about the bones of a different combat style that came out after 1974 Dungeons & Dragons. It's going to make it a bit easier to play versus the 1974 version, but there's some problems with it too, but it does make nearly a perfect system. There's also going to be a hilarious attack that probably is not going to be seen in any other editions, at least to my knowledge is not found in any of the other editions. That may have been part of the reason why we have special attacks moving forward. Okay, so I've talked a lot about combat systems in original Dungeons & Dragons so far, and I have many videos on these. I've talked about the blending of different things and this type of stuff, but now we're going to take a very iconic man-to-man combat and blend it with the alternative combat system that's found in the 1974 main rulebook. It makes this system that I feel like is pretty good and has a lot of original feel to it. So let's start about how these two blend together. So the first system is man-to-man combat. That is actually found in Chainmail. When I did my actual play, that was sort of the system I did, mixed with a little bit of other stuff. But that was basically what I did when I played it. It's done on 2d6 versus a d20. The d20 system is called the attack matrix, and that's found in 1974 Dungeons & Dragons. The original core the original three core rule books for Little Brown Books. And this would be what ended up winning and becoming THAC0 sometime in the future, which then became Ascended armor class, which is what they even use in 5e. This additional information added to the alternative combat system takes these two systems, blends them together, making an unusual mix. I know I've said that a couple times, and I'm going to explain why. But what it's doing is it's taking the weapon versus armor class of the man-to-man and then trying to install it into the D20 system that is used in 1974, but it's not including or taking into consideration weapon class. And I feel like that's important to know because there's a lot of things that weapon class is used for. Now in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, something that comes out around this time, a little after it, there was something that was closer to THAC0 and in between attack matrix and has its own little thing. And though there are differences, the nuances between these are not really something that we're going to talk about in this video. And this system basically would be there all the way to 1989. One of the similarities to this, though, was that it re-added weapon class in by changing it slightly and calling it weapon speed. But we'll talk more about that later. So let me get into how the chainmail version of man-to-man works. Okay, so you roll 2d6. The results are going to be between 2 and 12. There are going to be some numbers that are more likely to be rolled than others. For example, if you're trying to get a 6, you can roll a 1 and a 5. You can roll a 2 and a 4, and you can roll 2 3s. So if you're trying to roll a 2 or a 12, there's only one way to get there. You either roll snake eyes or you roll bullseyes. And that's the only way to get there. So you can tell there's 3 ways to get to a 6 and there's one way to get to a 2 or a 12. Therefore, logically, it's going to be harder to roll that. Now there's more to it, and that gets into like the science of rolling dice and math and bigger ways. And we're not going to get into that either. I actually talk about that in the man-to-man combat system. And I think also in the fantasy combat system. So I don't need to get back into it now. But I think that clearly shows that 3 is better than 1 when you're trying to get a certain result. Now in the man-to-man combat system, you roll a weapon versus an armor type. It gives you a very specific target you need to hit on 2d6. And then that changes based upon the weapon you're using and the armor you're rolling against. So a dagger versus plate mail needs a certain number, and a dagger versus chainmail needs a different number. A mace versus plate mail needs a certain number, and a mace versus chainmail needs a different number. This is how that works. Now, also in chainmail, they used a binary system. A hit equals death. They didn't actually have damage. 1974 rules went ahead and added damage, added some depth to it, added some dynamics to the combat, also extending out how long combat was. While I feel like this is a better system, that's because we're rolling a character. If I was rolling 400 characters, I wouldn't want to roll damage and then track damage on 400 characters. So it is situational and specific to the combat system we're using, if that makes sense. What damage allows you to do is it allows you to take a hit and then come back, and to be able to be healed and maybe have wounds that carry over from one fight to the other, or to take a hit, be damaged, maybe gain some scar or blood stain or whatever, and then come back and win the fight. It makes it more realistic. We're not going for true realism because that system would be so complicated it'd be impossible for us to figure out on our own. We'd have to have a computer at best to figure it out. I feel like this adding damage to the game builds tension, as a single hit doesn't kill your character you've been playing for a while. It takes maybe multiple hits, though hit points were low back then, so you could die very easily in a single hit. But the fact that you had to roll damage, that builds a dynamic in tension versus, you're hit, you're dead. They tried that in Dungeons & Dragons when it first started, and it was met very negatively in the playtesting, so they went ahead and added damage. So we have the evolutionary of life versus death, and we've moved on towards damage. This would continue to evolve by moving to the attack matrix, moving from a 2d6 system to a d20 system. Part of the reason why this was, and what made it better, was it was easier to figure out armor classes by assigning a number, and then you could modify off of that number. Now, it made it complicated when you're coming from the man-to-man rules, because that didn't use a number. That uses plate and shield equals this. And that's a problem. So they had like this ugly ducking phase where things didn't make sense and we're not matching up good and things didn't work right. But they kind of got rid of that with the future books. The attack matrix, as I said before, would become the THAC0 system. Again, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. It does become more streamlined and better, in my opinion, as the system came out. And then eventually they figured out they didn't have to do descending armor class. They went to ascending armor class, making it even a better system. But that's a whole different video for a different time. So let's go ahead and figure out how this attack matrix works. Okay, so you take all of your bonuses, positive or negative, and you add it to the attack roll. You roll a d20, that's your attack roll, and then you subtract what your attack matrix number, aka your THAC0 number, is. So for example, in this book 1, 1974 rules, in my PDF it's page number 19, but in yours it might be different. Let's say that you're playing an elven fighter who needs to roll a 17 to hit AC 2, aka plate mail armor with shield. So if you're using THAC0, that would be a 19 that is needed to hit AC 0, meaning that you need a 17 to hit AC 2. So right here we are the same as THAC0. Now, as a first level elven fighter with a positive strength modifier of +2 using a +1 magic sword, you of course get the +1 because you're an elf fighter, and you get +1 from the sword, and you get +2 from the strength. That gives you a total of +4. So you needed a 17 to hit AC 2, aka plate mail with shield, but now you need a 13 + 4, which is 17, to hit that same armor class. 17 minus 17 gives you AC 2, which is perfect. In the scaling here, you can see how they match that up, and you can see how that works. In THAC0, it's very similar. Where THAC0 and Attack Matrix are different is when you level, it doesn't level the same. That's where the main difference is. That's where that little nuance is. Treating this as THAC0, to me, kind of clears things up and cleans things up, but that's because I'm used to the THAC0 system. It also gets a little messy when you start digging into magical shields and magical armors, and you start getting into those bonuses, or you run into other things like spells or maybe negatives, like when you go weapon versus armor. Those modifiers can be positive, but they also can be negative, and they're also specific, this weapon versus that type of armor. which makes it more complicated, and you may not know it off the top of your head. Let's go ahead and go back to AC2 though, with plate, mail, and shield. And from there in the very top, you can see that you have daggers and hand axes, which both have a -3 modifier to the attack roll. And a military pick, slightly down from there, has a +2. These examples are applied to the D20 roll, the attack roll. That means that if you rolled a 15, for example, with a hand axe or a dagger, that would actually be a 12. And then you'd add all of your other bonuses. And if you were to roll a 15 with a military pickaxe, you would have a 17. And then you apply all those bonuses. And in this situation, the military pickaxe would hit the AC2, aka the plate, mail, and shield, and the dagger and the hand axe would not. Now, if you look closely next dagger, there is a little asterisk there that gives different bonuses, and it actually has a whole different special list of benefits for if someone is prone and off their horse. But I really feel like this is not just prone. I would also apply this to paralyzed, held, restrained, unable, anything that was unable to defend itself. So sleeping, for example, would be that way as well. And basically the way I interpret this is they put the dagger up between the plates and then they push in and make their attack roll, meaning that they get these bonuses. And as you can see here with these bonuses, they remove the -3 the plate mail would normally give a dagger, in this case give it +3. Thus making, instead of a 13 to hit, they need a 10 to hit if you're going back to that elf fighter first level with a sword, in this case, right? Same thing. And then having the +1, the elf, the +2 from strength, that gives you the +4. The +3 from having a sword against a prone or defenseless target makes it +7. That means you need a 10 to hit AC2, aka plate, mail, with shield. So this system is kind of impressive and is moved to the D20, which frees up some of that unusual dice rolling that you might run into, makes it work better with the ACs that are already in the game. What do you lose? Well, you lose weapon class. And what is weapon class? Well, weapon class gives you the ability to make more than one attack a round if you're doing a certain type of attack or that type of stuff. It also removes the ability for you to make parries and those type of things, and talking about weapon breaks. So it loses some of the dynamics of the game, but as I talked about earlier, if we move too close towards what would be realistic, it would be too hard to figure out. Now, AD&D tries to tackle this, and they change it to weapon speed, and they change the difference between weapon class and weapon speed slightly. And I'm not going to get into that nuance. I talk about it in the man-to-man combat, and I'll talk about it again when I talk about weapon speed in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition. But basically, there is a difference. They do try and clean it up. I think they do a much better job than if they try to put weapon class here. However, removing that weapon class while adding the armor versus the weapon versus armor is a bit concerning, and I'm not 100% sure how that plays out. I think that if you do it evenly across the board and then utilize the fantasy combat, which I'll get to in a second, I think it works better, and I'm going to do some play testing to see what I think about it. So look for more actual plays where I'm doing that coming up here soon, I hope. And it makes it somewhere between a little bit more of a dance and not being so complicated that you have to ask other people what's going on, I hope. The removal of parry, though, makes me a little sad, and I have to debate whether or not I'm going to allow defensive fighting back into the game, or if that is too powerful. I'm on the side of bringing it back to the game and maybe just calling it defensive fighting versus parry. And I don't know if I'm going to have weapon breaks. I had a system for it in the other version of the game, and I liked it there, but I'm not 100% sold on it being in a D20 system, because it's actually easier to roll a 1 than it is to roll snake eyes in 2d6, for example. I've said this a few times, But as long as the referee knows and maybe has conferred with the PCs what's going on and what it is, and they have established the way things are, and it's not specifically targeting a person negatively, I think it's a good thing. I think one of the things that the party needs to know, and the referee especially needs to know, is that Supplement 1 in this additional combat system, when you get into the variant monster damage, also has multi-attack. And multi-attack makes certain creatures that were not fearsome way more fearsome. Some might say that there is a negative to the system by only having one attack per round. Some people see this as a positive because you get through the round faster. It also is going to make casters who have had a lot of nerfs in this book more effective, because in the prior systems where the fighter could have more than one attack, now they only have one attack. So that's something to take into consideration too. Is that where you want the power balance to be? I also like to change it away from a numerical number to the plate, mail, and shield if you're going to be using the armor, the weapon versus armor type, because I'm not a huge fan of that. Or going to the modifiers only, but don't try and do both at the same time. It's too confusing, especially for newer players who just don't automatically know that PS stands for plate and shield, as you would see in my actual plays, and then that means AC2, for example. And then, of course, CS is chainmail and shield. So I think if you do it, go deep into that, or adjust away from that, if that makes sense. I would choose which system you're going to use and then make sure all the things represent that and not cross back and forth. Basically, as they are wrote right now, they use both systems in different books. Before I get into the fantasy combat, let me talk about the system or the new attack that I found to be rather funny. One might say hilarious. That is only going to be found in this rule book, the Supplement 1 rules. I don't think it really ever got reprinted or released in other editions, but it was one of the first ones, and then it became other types of special attacks, and that would be the hug. So lycanthrope bears and owlbears have a new attack called the hug, and what that is, if they hit with both claws, which their claws do a d6 damage, they can instead do a hug attack, which is 2d8 damage. Their wording is a little silly. They don't actually have grapple in original Dungeons and Dragons, but I could see the argument that a strength check versus a dexterity check to get free could be a thing. I could also see that once you have a person held, they could choose to do a hug, or they could choose to maybe do a bite and automatically hit, because they already have you restricted. And if you are restrained by the rules, that means you can't cast magic. So there's all kinds of chaos that could come from this new attack that would be very interesting. And then there are other things that are not listed in there that will be listed in future rules that would automatically probably have the same type of thing. Things like octopuses and that type of stuff. But in future editions of the game, they would come up with things like rend attacks and pounce and grappling type stuff. And I think the hug attack was probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest versions of that. Okay, so I've talked about fantasy combat a couple times. Let me go ahead and talk about the difference and how hard it would be to swap one system for the other. Fantasy combat doesn't actually use weapon class, for example. They just have a standardized type of defense, this creature versus that creature. And the reason why they have that is because the creatures don't really have a standardized weapon. If you are a dragon, let's say an ancient dragon, then you're not going to have a sword or a hammer. You're going to have claws, you're going to have fangs, you're going to have wings, a tail buffet, that type of stuff. So instead of making it that way, they just make it different. And they just basically give you a target number to hit. Also, another feature of fantasy combat that makes it one step closer to man is it rolls 2d6 to hit. Now, if a dragon is attacking a person, Obviously, they're not a dragon. Even though they're technically a hero, they wouldn't roll on that. They just roll normal to hit, which would be a D20, which would then apply these modifiers, which really means this system merges flawlessly into it and actually makes that smoother. Now, in the fantasy combat, the biggest thing is if you're not a hero or a lord or a wizard, you are unable, or technically an elf, I guess, you're unable to hurt things on the fantasy chart. So if you're attacking a chimera and you're 3 dudes, you have no ability to hurt that chimera. So it's actually like an earliest version of weapon negation that was in the game. And this came out before D&D. Also, figuring out that dragon is plate with a shield, or maybe just plate, would be pretty easy as well. Making it, again, like I said, a very smooth transition. The main difference between these two combat systems is, frankly, a little bit of gatekeeping. They wanted to have magical or fantastic, legendary, maybe even mythologically endowed creatures, hard to kill, so that no one's out there killing Bigfoot unless you yourself are a Bigfoot or an elf or a hero. That bard from The Hobbit needed to be a certain level of legendary so that his arrow could pierce the hide of Smaug versus all the other arrows being fired at Smaug. They wanted to have that difference. So yeah, there's a little bit of a gatekeeping saying you can't do damage unless you're one of these people. However, I think this is a good gatekeeping, making it so where you feel that pressure, like, ooh, can't fight that. We can do nothing against it. Run away. And then later, when you're able to, because everyone should be encouraged to get there, which is outside of the gatekeeping stereotype, it's so nice. You're finally able to do damage to this thing. This thing you've been running from for 4 levels, you now can turn around and fight. And hopefully you win and don't die. So yeah, I think it is targeting a little bit of certain people, certain groups, certain levels. But I think that you can work through it and then come out the other side, and it's more meaningful combat. Anyways, guys, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Let's have a conversation down below. You know, these YouTube videos get no extra boost from having these conversations down below. These conversations down below are designed for me and you to be able to talk and to connect, to build that community that I want with you guys. So I hope you guys enjoy. I look forward to seeing you guys next video, and keep rolling those dice.